Morning, we are on 101B of Aleph Amud Beis. We're dedicating class to Herschel Tzvi Ben Yosef, whose your text today, was an engineer in the underground during the war. This is in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. Wow, okay, so we'll dedicate to his memory. All right, we're on the third line from the top of the page, and the third to last word, which is Yosef Rav Idi, right? Kuf Aleph on the base. It's going to be Kuf Aleph with the two dots. And count 3 lines down, third to last word. So what did we have? We had in the next page, yeah. I think this is one that's flipping backwards. So we had is Kuf Aleph with 2 dots, Kuf Aleph on the bet. Third line, third to last word, Yativ Rav Idi, Yosef Rav Idi, Ashkenazic pronunciation. So where we are is, we're now segueing into a new discussion, which is not related to Kiddush. It's related to the law of changing location while one is eating. And what happens? What is the status of that person's bracha, his blessing? We got there because of Kiddush. Right? We're discussing originally the Kiddush made in Shul on Friday night, in which Rav and Shmuel disputed as to whether or not there's validity to the Kiddush, considering that the person is not eating in the place of his Kiddush, or whether it's just for the guests who are eating in Shul, which is what we concluded. But both Rav and Shmuel agreed that either way, whether the person listening to the Kiddush has fulfilled his obligation for Kiddush or not, they both agreed that the bracha the person made on the wine doesn't extend to his house. And this is a law related to the laws of Birchas Hanen and the bracha over enjoying food. That if I'm making a bracha in one place and I eat something and then I change location, I have to make a new bracha in that new location because it's considered a new act of eating because it's a new place. Rabbi Yochanan disputed that and said, well, actually, as long as you had in mind and you didn't, like, as far as your mind is concerned, you're eating one meal, even though you switch places in the middle, in Rabbi Yochanan's view, the bracha continues. The last thing we had was the Gemara rejected that view, citing to a Mishnah text from Brachas, from the Gemara in Brachas, but there it says, Shinu Yayin, Shinu Makom Tzarech Levarech. When a person moves location during a meal, one is required to make a bracha again. Because when you move to a new place, it's a new meal, it's a new sitting, it's a new eating, and therefore requires to make a bracha again. Okay, so we're going to, and now for the next page or so, invite a number of different views regarding this and caveats as to when and how this rule applies. And there are a few things to take into consideration. And they're all going to come up. And because of all these different considerations and overlapping considerations, there's going to be a considerable number of views as to how to interpret these various different caveats and how they interplay with each other. So we're just going to learn the Gemara as we have on its most basic level with Rashi's interpretation, sometimes Rashbam. And then when we get to the Shulchan Aruch and we get to the Code of Jewish Law in Kuf Ayin Ches, chapter 178, then we're going to get the full picture of all the various different views and their final conclusion. So what are the considerations to take into account? Number one, the first thing to take into consideration is the bracha you're making, right? We have 2 brachas to make. We have a bracha before we eat and a bracha when we're done eating. So the first thing is, I'm about to get up and go. If my meal extends, I don't have to make an after blessing on the food I just finished eating. That's question 1, the after blessing of the food that I'm leaving behind. Question 2 is, when I get to that new place, do I have to make a new bracha on the food I'm about to eat? Question 2, it's another issue. The after blessing from the food I left, or the new blessing on the food I'm about to eat. Another consideration is, what am I eating? And is what I am eating constitute a meal or a snack? And that will change how I think about it. Because a meal is like anchored to a place you're sitting, a snack might not be, right? Well, what if I'm eating a meal, but I'm traveling? I'm sitting on a horseback and I'm moving as I eat, right? I'm traveling, or I'm in my car for the same price, right? Or something like that. I don't know. That's another consideration.
Plane or a train.
Yeah. Another consideration is, when I left the meal, was I the only one to leave? Are there still people sitting there that kind of anchors the meal saying it's not done yet? or did we all leave? These are all considerations to take into account, and they're going to be introduced to us one by one with varying opinions, giving us multi-layers of how to look at it. So again, we're going to learn the Gemara on its most basic level, and when we get to the Shulchan Aruch, all the considerations we brought up are going to be synthesized in an organized fashion with all the various different views and the halachic conclusions. So let's begin.
It seems like a repeat of what's been already discussed in brachas, right?
It's a lot of overlap in brachas. Yeah. Some of the stuff here is new. Some of the stuff has been cited already in brachas. Yeah. We're going to see when we get to Kufay and Ches, when we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to see in the footnote, sometimes he'll cite to this Gemara and sometimes he'll cite to the Gemara in brachas.
Okay.
I don't like this thought of, I might, of saying that you had something in mind. Because you sit down every time. I might sit over there.
Right.
I might do this. I might do that.
Yeah, as we'll see, it's not so simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you remind me, I told you, I think last time you remind me, there's a parentheses in Yaltei B'Shulchan Aruch, which throws a wrench into a lot of it. So we'll discuss this as we get there. Okay, let's see. So third to top line, third to last word. Yosef Rav Idi Bar Abin. Rav Idi Bar Abin was sitting, Kamed Rav Chizda, in the presence of Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda, a leading authority, at one point was even the exilarch. Yosef Rav Chizda, and Rav Chizda was sitting. The Ka'amar, and he said, Mishmeid Rav Huna, in the name of Rav Huna. The following statement. Hadamr is that which we have been told in the Mishnah we quoted in the last class. Shinui Mokim, that when a person changes location, Zarech Levarech, he must make a new bracha. That was the last learning. That was the last quote that we had, which rejected Rabbi Yochanan's view. This is consistent with Rav and Shmuel's view that you make a bracha agafen in shul. It doesn't extend to your wine you're drinking at home, and you have to make a bracha again, even if the kiddush counted. The wine doesn't extend. The bracha on the wine doesn't extend. The hagafen. So that statement says Rav Huna, Lo shanu is not taught ella. It's a double negative. So we're narrowing down what are the circumstances of this teaching. Only mi bias la bias, when you move from one building to another building. So if you're going from one building to another, then the bracha doesn't extend, as is the case when a person makes here's kiddush in shul. The bracha agafen is in one building, and his home is a different building. And therefore, when he gets to his home, even if he fulfilled his obligation of kiddush, say he ate something in shul, if he wants to have a glass of wine at home, new bracha agafen. Aval but mimakim lamakim, from one place to another. Loi, the law doesn't apply, and therefore his bracha does extend. What does one place to another mean? There are all kinds of commentaries. Rashi's interpretation means 2 rooms in the same house, even 2 different floors. That's how Rashi interprets it. So if I'm here in this room and I'm doing something and I go downstairs, no new bracha. Assuming that I had in mind that I'm extending my meal, I'm going downward. And this is relevant. You have Rabbi Getzi's kiddush up here, and you have the kiddush downstairs, and you made kiddush downstairs, and you want to go upstairs to say l'chaim, but you come back downstairs. So when you come up, you have no new hagafen in this view. Yeah. Again, this is in this view. We have all kinds of views. But in this view, we're going with this Rashi's reading. Nothing we say now should be taken halachically until we get to the Alter B'Shulchan Aruch, because again, there's going to be all kinds of different circumstances and scenarios and opinions, but we're going through the lines upon which all the halachas that you're discussing have been built.
Key question then is, when is there continuity and when is there not?
Correct. So in this view, if you go from one building to another, no continuity, and therefore new bracha is required in the building. If you're in the same building, in Rashi's reading, right, all Rav Huna said is place to place, then there is continuity and you don't have to make a new bracha. Rashi explained that place to place means within the same building, even from one floor to another. That's how Rashi reads it. And we're going to go with that reading. Okay, so this was Rav Chizda speaking, where Rav Idi Bar Avin is sitting. Rav Chizda was speaking, quoting Rav Huna. So Amar le Rav Idi Bar Avin. So Rav Idi Bar Avin heard this and responds, what you just said, quoting Rav Huna, Hachi tanina le b'masnisa. This is actually how it was taught in the Mishnaic text, the Beit Rab Hinuk, in the study house of Rab Hinuk. Now, Amrila, others say, the Masnisa the Beit Bar Hinuk. in the study house of the son of Hinnock, either Rav Hinnock or Bar Hinnock. At any rate, so again, we're talking before the printing press and before widespread publication, where everything's in manuscript. And one person's manuscript could be somewhat different than another person's manuscript, right? So Rav Chizda says a teaching in the name of Rav Huna, and Rav Idi Bar Abin says, well, actually, when I was at Rav Hinnock or Bar Hinnock, whichever one the version is, I actually saw a Mishnaic text that said, Kavoseich, exactly what you just said. So the Gemara therefore says, now, okay, this is the end of the conversation. No, I'm sorry, the conversation continues. So Rav Chizda speaks in the name of Rav Huna, giving the caveat to when the law of new location and new bracha applies, and says, if you're going to a new building, no continuity, require new bracha, same building, yes continuity, no new bracha. Rav Idi Bar Avin replies, well, that's not actually Rav Huna's teaching, it's a Mishnah that we found that is in the text of the house of Rav Hinnock or Bar Hinnock. So the question now becomes, what did Rav Huna mean? We begin by assuming that Rav Huna also had that text. And if Rav Huna had that text, and he nonetheless went ahead and taught something, it means he must be adding a nuance. Otherwise, why would he be repeating the same thing? But we have to remember that, again, this is before the days of printing, so everything's in manuscript. So whenever you have a quote in the Gemara, so-and-so said X, it's not just a quote the person once said. What it means is that the person gave a lecture, maybe a series of lectures, explained his view, and at the end said, memorize this phrase. And this phrase will be everything you need to know about this whole lecture, condensed into one sentence. And then that sentence becomes passed down from generation to generation. So-and-so said X. And then it requires the one looking at this quote to unpack what's being said. So you assume that if there's a quote coming down to you from someone, it's because there's a novelty here, not just because you're repeating what someone else said. So if Rav Huna had the Mishnah, which said the exact same thing he did, then why are you making us memorize this line in your name? We already know it from another text that we memorized, right? And therefore the conversation continues. Is Rav Huna simply coming to tell us and memorize a Mishnah that we already know? If we must conclude, we must conclude that Rav Huna did not have that manuscript, and therefore he told them on his own accord to memorize this law, not knowing it was already in the Mishnaic text. So for anyone else, says the Gemara, if you hear from Rav Huna X, don't think it's a new law. It's the same thing as the Mishnah. He just didn't have the Mishnah, so he told us to remember this. Okay. Bottom line, everybody's in agreement so far, whether from the Mishnah or from Rav Huna, that moving to a new location and making a new bracha is only if you go to a different building. If you're in the same building, no new bracha. Gemara continues. Now, Rav Chizda was still sitting at this conversation. The Ka'amar, he said, Mishmei de Nafshei. Now he said his own ruling. So first he was quoting Rav Huna, that new location means new building. Rav Idi says, well, it's a Mishnah already. So Rav Chizda says, yeah, maybe, but Rav Huna didn't know about the Mishnah. Now Rav Chizda says, here's something that I'd like to add to the conversation. Namely, Hadamris, that which we said, that when you go to a new location, you must make a new bracha, which we said earlier means a new building. Loi Amran is not said Ella only, so we're limiting it to the Dvarim she'ein tunim bracha lacharein b'makayman. Quote, only applies to things that do not require an after bracha in its place. Then ein sarach levarech. Then you don't have to make a new bracha. So let's explain. All right, so we mentioned at the beginning that we have different considerations. The first consideration, how far is he moving? So now we settle that. If you're in the same building, no new bracha, new building, new bracha. Okay, now we get to what are you eating? So, and to what level of permanence is there to what you are eating? And the way that's defined in halacha is, does the food require you to make an after blessing in the spot where you ate? Or does the halacha say make an after blessing whenever you're done, wherever you are? That will tell you to what degree does the halacha anchor you to the spot you're eating. Meal versus a snack. Now, meal versus snack is not a correct designation because meal versus snack in colloquial sense, a cookie, for example, would be a snack by colloquial definition, but not by this definition. But this definition is, does the halacha require you to make an after blessing of the place you ate your food? Now, anything that requires you to make the full bracha, certainly like the whole benching with the 4 big long brachas, that's certainly something that you have to do, you're supposed to do in the spot where you ate. But even the me'en shalosh, the smaller bracha that we refer to as ala michya, that blessing is required to be done in the place where you ate, as opposed to the bar nefashot. Follow?
Yeah, otherwise you do it 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
I don't know about that long, but it doesn't have. You don't have to be in the spot where you ate. But anything that requires you, okay, so which means anything of the shivat aminim, anything of the 7 kinds, require an ala michya or an ala perot, right? That bracha ala michya, it's halachically it's called the me'en shalosh, which means it's a minor version of the 3. Why is that? Because benching, the big birchat hamazon, has 4 blessings in it. Hazanas ha'olam. The next one is al aretz v'al michya, and the third one is bnei Yerushalayim, and the 4th one is hatov ha'metiv. Right now, the 4th one is rabbinic, so that one's not the biblical command. The biblical command is the first 3. Al aretz, hazanas ha'koil, al aretz, and bnei Yerushalayim. The bracha ala michya is a condensed version of those 3. That's why it's called me'en shalosh. It's similar to the 3, which means it has a biblical ring to it. I don't want to get into whether it's biblical or rabbinic, but it certainly has a biblical ring to it, beyond just the bar nefashot, which is just a certainly rabbinic blessing, thanking for the food. So if you're eating one of those things that require the ala michya, the me'en shalosh, it has a biblical anchor, so that bracha turns it into a meal that anchors you to the spot where you ate, even if it happens to be cookies, grapes, olives, because they're all the shivat aminim, or dates, figs, and certainly wheat and barley, which would be the mizanot elements.
And wine too.
And wine, correct. Wine would be in the ala gefen, right? Okay. So now, says Rav Chizda, if that's the kind of thing you're eating, that you're required to eat in the place where you, again, let's go to Had Amris, you see? Okay, Had Amris, that which we said, Shinui Makim, that when you change location, Sarech Lavarech, you have to make a new bracha. Loi Amran Ella, it's only said, Bedvarim with things, She'ein Turunin bracha lacharim b'makoyman, that do not require you to go back. Then you have to make a new bracha. So if you're drinking a glass of water, and you're not required to make the after blessing in the place where you eat, then when you go to a new location, you have to make a new shahakal. But if you're eating something that requires you to go back to the original place to eat, a cookie or a glass of wine, then when you go to a new location, you don't have to make a new bracha. What's the logic? My time, what's the logic here? Because lakfiya kama hadar. You're going back to your original place. If the halacha requires you to come back to the original place when you eat, to make your after blessing, so I'm eating a cookie or a bag of or some few cookies. So I eat one here, I make a bracha here. So when I walk away, the halacha requires me to come back to my place and eat and make a bracha after blessing, which means as I'm walking around, the halacha is anchoring me to the spot. So I don't have to make a new bracha when I walk away because I'm still tied to the spot where I began. There's continuity. But if I'm drinking a cup of water, the halacha does not require me to make the after blessing in the spot that I'm drinking. So when I go somewhere else, it's a new drink.
Even a different room in the same building?
Oh, good question. That's what I say. When it comes to like the halacha, and the Gemara introduces a bunch of different caveats. And how do they overlap? It's not quite clear. But assuming that there's a flow to the Gemara's conversation, and we're taking Rashi's interpretation, that would mean even if I'm in a new house, I don't have to make a new bracha.
You're anchored to...
Because I'm anchored to come back to the place where I began. If I'm drinking a cup of water and I go to a new house, certainly a new bracha because I'm not anchored to that old place. What if I move rooms? Not clear. Right? The Gemara isn't clear. The Gemara just keeps introducing these new elements, and more elements are going to be added But all the commentaries get to, okay, so what happens when all these things overlap? The Gemara doesn't really explain itself. That's what all the commentaries do. What do we do when all these different caveats overlap? We're going to get to some of the overlap, and then the Shulchan Aruch is going to synthesize all that for us. Meaning, I'm changing location. I'm drinking a glass of water, but I'm going to a different room. Right. I'm drinking a glass of water, but I'm going to a different room. Is that a new place or not? Yeah, all these things overlap, but this is the main idea.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Not related to this. Let's say water, like a water bottle. I get to work in the morning. I have a water bottle. I do shackle. I stay. It's one like confined space, like it's one big room. Let's say. Do I need to do it all day every time I open a water bottle, or I did it and then it's for the day?
Okay, we're going to get into that in the Shulchan Aruch. It's very involved, but the bottom line is actually that if like it's not you refilling it. It's one water bottle you know is there. Even if you're refilling it, it's there the whole day, and like in your mind, you're always drinking from it. You don't necessarily have to make a new bracha again, unless you get into your car. Then maybe you have to make a new bracha there because it's out of the building. We're going to get to all that, but these are the big questions. And again, the parentheses not the Shulchan Aruch is going to talk about that as well, which is going to make it a little more difficult. But yes, okay. So this was Rav Chizda's view. But Rav Sheshes says, "Echad zeh ve'echad zeh tzarich levarich." Doesn't matter what kind of food you're eating, you have to make a new bracha when you go to a new location. So it's disputed already. So now we have two qualifiers. Right? We have the original halacha. The original halacha is new place, new bracha. Two qualifiers. Qualifier A is new bracha is only if it's a new building. Qualifier B is, are you anchored to the original spot? If you're anchored to the original spot because the halacha requires you to go back, no new bracha. If you're not anchored to the original spot because the halacha does not require you to go back, yes, new bracha because you're not anchored. But then Rav Sheshes says, well, it doesn't matter which one it is. If you go to a new place, new bracha. So second qualifier Rav Sheshes dismisses. Okay. Now comes third qualifier. Third consideration. Meisvei, the Gemara challenges. What's Meisvei? What kind of question is Meisvei? Anyone?
Huh?
What kind of question is Meisvei? Anyone?
Was that equal? No.
That's a Rami. Meisvei is a source greater than the person talking. I think you got it last time. That's why I asked.
Right.
Okay, Meisvei is a question that's coming from the source above the one who's speaking. So the one who's speaking here is Rav Sheshes and Rav Chizda. Rav Sheshes, who is a scholar from the Gemara's era, and the Gemara is now about to quote a Mishnaic text that comes from the Masechta Brachos, which reads, quote, B'nei Chabura, members of a group, Shayu Mesubin Lishtois, they were settled into drinking. I'm trying to be deliberate in my translation here because it's all important. It doesn't say they were eating, so they didn't necessarily wash for Hamotzi, but it says they were settled into drinking. What were they drinking? We don't know. But they were settled into drinking, which means there's some sort of permanency to their drinking, not just casually drinking a glass of water. They were They're sitting around and drinking, presumably it's a wine. Right? And they uprooted their feet. Lot says to go out, which means it wasn't just that they were casually having a drink and they walked in and out of the room. They were settled and they got up to go out. For what reason? Likras chatzanaik, likras kala, to go greet a bride or a groom. Back in the old day, chas and kala were paraded down the street to go to the chuppah. So there's a procession, there's music, and they're sitting in their home and living room having this. They're settled into drinking, and they decide to go out to greet the chas and kala, wish mazel tov, wave as the parade goes by. So now says this Mishnayos text, kishen yotzin, when they leave, ein turnin bracha l'mafreya. As they leave, they are not required to make an after blessing over the wine that they were just drinking, because they're about to come back. They only stepped outside for a minute to wave to the chas and kala. So their meal is not done. Their settled drinking isn't done yet. So no reason to make a bracha after bracha. And therefore, kishin chayzim, when they come back, again, ain't turning bracha lachatchila. They don't have to make a new bracha on their wine. They're going to continue drinking because they're still anchored to their spot. They just went out temporarily to wave to the chas and kala. Yes, clear? But then says the Mishnah qualifier. When is this true that they are anchored to the original spot that they were sitting? even though they just walked out to go greet the chas and kala, is only she'nichu sham zaken echela. They left behind at the table an older gentleman or a sick person. It doesn't have to be someone elder or someone sick, but the halacha assumes everybody's going to get up to go greet the chas and kala unless the person is too old to get up or the person's too weak, he's too frail. So they left someone behind. The point is someone's there. It doesn't have to be elder or sick, but someone is there. He didn't go out. Then he, because he's still there, anchors them to their meal. Right? So when they walked out, they don't make an after blessing of the food. And therefore, when they come back, they don't have to make a new bracha on the food, on the drink, because someone is sitting there. And that person sitting there ties them to the table, even though they're not present. Yeah? Aval bat, if they left no one behind, there's no elder, there's no one frail, so no one left behind, everybody got up and left to go greet the chas and kala. Then says the Mishnah, that's a complete break in the meal. And if when they go out, they're required to make an after bracha before they leave. And therefore, when they come back, after having waved to the chas and kala, they have to make a new bracha to begin with. End quote. Okay, so this is a new caveat now, which is, even if you move location, which require you to make a new bracha, because someone is sitting there, that anchors you to the old meal. The person sitting there who hasn't left indicates that all the other people are expected to come back, and therefore there's still continuity. No after blessing when they leave, no new bracha when they come back. Okay, so it's a third element, but how does that serve as a contradiction to anyone who said anything earlier?
Or it was about the after blessing. Now it's
Okay,
the person behind.
Okay, so
Here it's about returning to the same location.
no,
The other case is
you're drinking somewhere else,
drinking somewhere else.
right? So exactly.
So
So
this would,
how does this end up as a contradiction?
Not a break.
It's a new. It seems to be a new situation. So explains the Gemara. From the fact that the Mishnah said they uprooted their feet from their meal to go somewhere else. The implication is they must be talking about the kind of food that requires you to make an after blessing in your spot. Otherwise, the Mishnah wouldn't have described it as they uprooted their feet to go somewhere. It's to begin with casual. If the Gemara says that they uprooted their feet from their sitting, it means they were anchored to their spot, halachically speaking, and they uprooted their feet away. So they must have been drinking wine, which requires them to make the after blessing in the spot that they were. Right? Now, even so, what did we say? What ties them to their spots? The person stayed behind. In Rav Shesh's view, and even according to Rav Chizda, what anchors you to your original spot? The very fact that the halacha requires you to come back to make a blessing. Whereas this Mishnah says, no, what anchors you? The older guy the guy who's left behind. And there's the contradiction.
What if he dies?
Even though it's a different scenario. Rav Chizda and Rav Shesh is talking about making a bracha on a new place. This Mishnah is talking about coming back to the same place. But the principle is the same. What anchors you to your original spot? Rav Chizda and Rav Shesh said, you know what anchors you to your old spot? The fact that you have to come back there and make a new bracha. Whereas this Mishnah said, well, we know you have to come back, and we actually know you are coming back. And still, unless you leave someone behind, you're not anchored. There's the contradiction. As the Gemara explains. Exactly, a more strict view. The time or the reason why we said you're anchored to your original spot and therefore you don't have to make a new bracha when you come back is the nichusham zaken echaylas, because they left behind an older or frail person. That's the scenario in which that when they leave, ain't ton and bracha mafreya, they don't have to make a bracha before they leave. When they come back, ain't ton and bracha lechatchila, they don't have to make a new bracha when they come back. But if they didn't leave anyone behind, when they go back, when they leave, they have to make an after blessing when they leave. When they come back, make a new bracha when they come back. Kasha, the Rav Chizda, this contradicts Rav Chizda's opinion. So let's bring this to where we are, and God willing, we'll get to the Gemara's answer tomorrow, which is going to introduce a new argument that's going to add more layers to the complexity of what's going on here. So what do we have so far? We have the original halacha is new place, new bracha. Caveat number one is what's considered new place, new building. Same building, no new bracha. Caveat number two is disputed. Rav Chizda said, if halacha requires you to come back to your spot, you're anchored to your original spot. No new bracha when you leave because you're still anchored to your original meal. If it's the kind of food that the halacha itself does not require you to come back, so when you leave, your meal's over. It's a new meal in the new place, new bracha. Rav Shesha said, doesn't matter. Wherever you go, new bracha, fine. Okay. Now comes this Mishnah and said, hold on a second. The only way for you to be anchored to your original meal, even if it's the kind of thing that requires you to come back anyway, the fact that the halacha requires you to come back does not anchor you to your original spot. Rav Chisda said it does. If the halacha requires you to come back, you're anchored to your original spot, and therefore no new bracha when you leave. But the Mishnah said, the fact that you have to come back halachically does not anchor you to your original spot. Only if you left someone behind is there an anchor. So this is a new element, which God willing, tomorrow we're going to see is not going to go away. We're just going to introduce new layers and new opinions. So all of, as I said at the beginning, all of these caveats are going to stack upon each other with not really much direct clarity from the Gemara itself as to how these different caveats overlap. They're just going to go introduce it, new caveat, new opinion, new caveat, new opinion, and then going to go on to the next subject. So before we go to the next subject, we'll go to the Alter Shulchan Aruch and get clarity on all these various different caveats and opinions. But now we're already seeing the themes stack up. New building, new room, what kind of food? Did you leave people behind? Are you anchored to the original spot? Are you not anchored to the original spot? Right, that's all going to be. Are you halachically anchored because halacha requires you to come back? Or are you colloquially anchored because someone's sitting there? And what happens when someone's sitting there when you drank a glass of water? Does that change it? You're sitting around drinking a glass of orange juice, drinking tea, let's say, which halacha does not require you to come back to make a bracha for, but you left someone behind. Does that anchor you or not? Right, because we're overlapping different things here, which the Gemara didn't clarify, but these are all things to consideration.
Uprooted, like you said,
Right.
water.
So then, but how do we apply the halacha though? Because the Mishnah doesn't address it directly. The Mishnah describes drinking wine, because it said they uprooted, right? But what about, let's say, they're drinking tea or coffee, and a bunch of people left and said, "Hey, you wait here. We're going to come back in 5 minutes because we're going next door to go say hello to someone." I don't know, whatever. Are they anchored or not? Or does it require that the halacha anchors them? Plus, there's a person there. Right, these are all.
You just left the bill. You didn't pay the bill.
Or that's also a good point, actually. If you have to come back, if you know that you have to come back because you need to pay, does that also anchor you? Right? So do you have to have a halachic anchor, a colloquial anchor, a halachic and a colloquial one, or one or the other? How does it work? So this is all going to come clear, God willing, when we get to the Shulchan Aruch. But you can see how the Gemara is stacking all these considerations up to get us to understand what we're talking about. Okay, have a wonderful day. And I can't say more clarity coming tomorrow, but more details coming tomorrow. Clarity will come, God willing.
That was very beautiful yesterday in Shabbat. And your father, there was a birthday being celebrated, and everybody was dancing with the young man whose birthday it was. The father stated the Torah at that time. And so, how much, so much so with regard to the Torah, which is, of course, the greatest divine revelation, with the sparks that are in the food, also.
You can't just walk away from them.
You can't walk away once you have declared the sparks and ignited the essence between yourself and the Eibishter.
You can't just walk away. Yeah.
It's very beautiful.
Thank you. Before I forget, tonight, God willing, 7:45 here, we have our Torah conference. We'll be hearing from Rabbi Levi on the subject of Lashon Hara. I'll be talking about showering on Yom Tif. What are the halachas around showering on Yom Tif? When you're allowed to, how you're allowed to, and so on. And Shmuel Zlagi will be talking about the Mishnah that discusses whether or not Shlichus is the highest calling. So, God willing, tonight, 7:45 here upstairs. Look forward to seeing everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Have a blessed day, Rabbi. All of you.